The small diner, tucked away at the corner of Westbrook Avenue and Maple Street in Greensboro, North Carolina, had long been a local haven. Its faded checkered floors, weathered menus, and the comforting scent of sizzling bacon brought a warmth that kept the regulars coming back day after day. It wasn't just a place for food. It was where everyone felt they belonged, where faces were familiar, even if names weren't always remembered. It was a sanctuary of sorts for those who liked their mornings predictable, steady, and filled with the clink of coffee cups and the hum of quiet conversations. As the door swung open, a soft jingle of the bell echoed through the diner. Anthony Hayes stepped inside, his navy blue suit crisp and sharp, the light gray tie adding an air of refinement that immediately contrasted with the homey laid-back atmosphere of the diner. His polished shoes clicked rhythmically against the tile floor, each step deliberate, each movement purposeful, though it was the kind of presence that turned heads, though not quite for the reasons he had hoped. He offered a polite nod to the waitress as he approached the counter, his smile warm yet measured. "Morning," he greeted, the words slipping easily from his lips. "Can I get a coffee and the breakfast special? Eggs over easy, please?" Sharon, the waitress, in her late 40s with a demeanor that radiated familiarity and kindness, returned the smile. "Coming right up, hon," she said, her pencil already poised over her notepad. Then with a knowing glance she added, "You're new around here." Anthony's chuckle was soft and easy. "Not exactly," he replied. "Just passing through for work. Thought I'd grab a bite before the day picks up." As Sharon made her way to the kitchen, Anthony took a seat, his phone sliding from his pocket. He scrolled absent-mindedly through his emails, barely noticing the whispers that had begun to swirl through the diner like an unnoticed breeze. At a booth in the corner, 3 men in their middle ages exchanged glances, their voices low but unmistakably tinged with suspicion. One of them, a wiry figure wearing a worn baseball cap, leaned toward the others, his voice cutting through the room. "Doesn't look like he belongs here, does he?" he muttered, his words carrying farther than he intended. "Nope," another man chimed in, his tone thick with skepticism. "Saw him hanging around that black car outside earlier. What's he up to?" Their words drifted over to Anthony, but he didn't let it bother him. Years in the business had taught him when to ignore and when to engage. He continued scrolling, his face a picture of calm despite the undercurrent of judgment that seemed to swell around him. A flicker of annoyance briefly crossed his features before it melted away, replaced with the practiced calm of someone used to unwanted attention. By the time Sharon returned with his coffee, the low murmur had grown louder, as if it had gathered momentum in the room. She placed the steaming cup in front of him, and Anthony gave a quiet thanks, trying to savor the moment of peace before the storm he could feel brewing in the air. He took a sip, the warmth of the coffee grounding him, though his eyes involuntarily flicked to the corner booth. One of the men, his expression steely and intent, was now pulling out his phone, the serious line of his face betraying no hint of casualness. "Yeah, I'd like to report something suspicious," the man said into the phone, his voice now quiet but edged with suspicion, his gaze never leaving Anthony. A slow exhale escaped Anthony's lips, and he set his coffee cup down with a quiet clink. He didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation. He knew exactly where it was heading. It was a script he had seen too many times before. The instant judgment, the assumption that anyone who didn't fit the mold was a threat. Outside the diner, the late morning sun bathed the rows of parked cars in golden light, casting long shadows on the pavement. His black sedan, polished to perfection, stood out starkly against the fleet of weathered trucks and compact cars that lined the lot. To the regulars, it was a glaring reminder that something, or someone, wasn't quite right, that the peace they enjoyed had been disrupted. Inside, the man at the booth continued his call, his voice steady, his words now sharp and deliberate. "Yeah, he's been hanging around. Acting strange. Wearing a suit. Doesn't really fit in here. Could be scoping out cars or something," he added, shooting a glance back at Anthony. "Black guy. Mid-30s. Driving a fancy car. Might want to send someone over." The dispatcher's voice on the other end was terse, no nonsense. "Unit on the way." Meanwhile, Anthony sat still calm. His fingers moved across his phone screen, tapping out responses to emails, unaware that the atmosphere in the diner had shifted from curiosity to judgment. Sharon brought his breakfast, a perfectly cooked plate of eggs and bacon, and set it in front of him with a bright smile. "Enjoy, hon," she said, her voice oblivious to the growing tension. "Thanks, Sharon," Anthony replied, picking up his fork but feeling no hunger. He knew that leaving abruptly would only fan the flames of suspicion. Minutes passed, but the unease in the air didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to build, thickening like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The distinctive sound of a police car pulling up outside made every head in the diner snap toward the window. The chatter quieted, replaced by the thick silence of anticipation. Anthony's jaw tightened imperceptibly as he watched the patrol car park behind his own. His calm exterior barely masked the awareness of the eyes upon him, of the judgment that was now palpable. The door opened, and Officer James Taylor stepped inside. In his early 40s, stocky and no-nonsense, Taylor's presence was one of authority. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his gaze sharp as it scanned the room. When his eyes locked on Anthony, the tension seemed to snap into place, each breath in the diner growing heavier. Taylor moved with purpose, his boots clicking against the tile as he walked straight toward Anthony. The murmurs of the patrons grew quiet, their curiosity and judgment now openly displayed. "Sir," Taylor's voice rang out curt and commanding. "Can you step outside with me for a moment?" Anthony set his fork down, slow and deliberate, and turned to face the officer. His voice, though calm, held a firm edge. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'll explain outside," Taylor replied, his tone dismissive. "Let's go." The room fell silent as Anthony stood, his movements deliberate, each step weighed with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. He reached for his wallet, but Taylor's hand shot out, stopping him. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Taylor barked, his voice now louder, more forceful. Anthony's eyes narrowed, but he complied, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "All right," he said evenly. "Let's go." Outside, the sunlight bathed them in warmth, but the tension remained. Taylor's demeanor shifted as he gestured to Anthony's car. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," he said, his voice taking on a sterner edge. "Mind telling me what you were doing out here?" "I parked my car and came in for breakfast," Anthony replied, his voice steady, betraying no hint of irritation at the absurdity of the situation. Taylor crossed his arms, eyes narrowing, scanning Anthony like a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "Got any ID on you?" "Yes," Anthony said, his voice unflinching. "It's in my wallet." "Don't move," Taylor ordered, his hand reaching for the handcuffs at his belt. Before Anthony could respond, the officer's movements were swift. He spun him around, pressing his arms behind his back. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Anthony said, his voice still calm but now edged with the faintest hint of frustration. Taylor didn't respond. He snapped the cuffs into place with a finality that echoed in the air. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. From inside the diner, the patrons watched from the windows, their faces a mix of curiosity, judgment, and the growing sense that they were witnessing something larger unfold. Phones pressed against the windows, the clicking of cameras punctuating the silence as the scene outside unfolded. Anthony stood tall, his posture straight, his gaze unflinching as Officer Taylor guided him toward the patrol car. The black sedan gleamed under the harsh sunlight, reflecting the tension that hung in the air. Taylor's grip on Anthony's elbow was firm, his stance deliberate. The soft click of the cuffs being adjusted punctuated the quiet, the metallic sound a sharp contrast to the murmurs of the growing crowd inside the diner. Onlookers stood frozen, eyes wide, some watching with disbelief, others with curiosity, drawn into the unfolding drama. Anthony remained composed, his voice calm but resolute. "Officer," he began, his tone firm but measured, "I've asked you to check my ID. It's in my jacket pocket. That should clear this all up." But Taylor merely scoffed, dismissing the request with a shake of his head. "We've heard that before," he muttered, his words laced with disdain. "People like you always have a story. We'll handle this at the station." A flicker of tension sparked in Anthony's jaw, but he didn't react beyond that. Years of experience had taught him the art of restraint, the ability to absorb blows without flinching. He knew when to hold his ground, and when to let ignorance wash over him. But the energy in the air was thickening, the electric undercurrent of suspicion, making the very ground beneath his feet feel unsteady. Just as Taylor reached to open the back door of the patrol car, a new sound broke through the oppressive quiet. The unmistakable roar of a second police car pulling up. Tires screeched slightly against the asphalt, and a younger officer stepped out, his expression one of confusion, as he surveyed the scene unfolding before him. "Taylor," the younger officer called, his voice carrying an edge of urgency as he approached briskly. "What's going on here?" Taylor barely looked up as he spoke, dismissing the question with a half-hearted gesture toward Anthony. "Got a call about a suspicious guy hanging around," he said, his words flat and unconvincing. "Found him in the diner, car's his, but we'll confirm that at the station." The younger officer froze mid-step, his eyes locked on Anthony, recognition flashing across his face like a lightning bolt. His mouth parted, disbelief rising in his voice. Wait, he said almost incredulously. Is this a joke? The confusion in Taylor's face was immediate, his brow furrowing as he glanced from the younger officer to Anthony. What are you talking about? He demanded, a sudden defensiveness creeping into his tone. The younger officer, Officer Daniels, hurried over, lowering his voice as he spoke with a sharp urgency. That's Special Agent Hayes, he said, his words rushing out now. FBI. He's one of the lead agents in this district. You've got the wrong guy. Taylor's face shifted from irritation to panic, his voice a tight whisper. You're telling me he's… Yes, Daniels interjected, his voice firm. Check his ID if you don't believe me. Anthony stood still, his calm composure not wavering. His frustration was evident, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply turned to Taylor, his gaze steady. I asked you to do that earlier, he said evenly, a hint of exasperation threading through his words. This could have been avoided. The weight of the moment settled in the air as Taylor hesitated. Fumbling with the jacket pocket, he pulled out Anthony's wallet, his hands shaking as he opened it. The flash of the badge, the unmistakable credentials, drained the color from his face. Taylor's lips parted, but no words escaped. He looked up at Anthony, then back at Officer Daniels, his mind racing but his voice stuck in his throat. Inside the diner, the crowd had thickened at the windows, murmurs rising with every passing second. Phones were still aimed at the scene, recording the unexpected turn of events. Taylor's face was flushed with humiliation as he glanced between Anthony and the growing crowd. He stood there frozen in place, unable to speak, while Anthony's gaze remained steady, unflinching. Time to take these off, Anthony said calmly, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. Daniels immediately stepped forward, his movements swift and efficient. He pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the cuffs, releasing the pressure on Anthony's wrists. I'm sorry, Agent Hayes, Daniels said sincerely, his voice tinged with regret. This should never have happened. Anthony rubbed his wrists, his face unreadable as he locked eyes with Taylor. No, he replied, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. It shouldn't have. The words lingered in the air, their weight impossible to ignore. Taylor stood motionless, his gaze averted, unable to meet Anthony's eyes. His rigid stance betrayed the storm of guilt and embarrassment that churned inside him. Meanwhile, the air around them felt heavier than the humidity that clung to the North Carolina air. The crowd inside the diner had gone silent, the murmurs now absent, as the people who had once whispered in suspicion now looked upon Anthony with respect and shame. Sharon, the waitress, stood just inside the door, her hand clasped tightly over her mouth, her eyes glistening with the sheen of unshed tears. Anthony exhaled, the breath deep but slow. His voice softened, but his words were no less sharp. We have to do better, he said, his gaze never leaving Taylor. All of us, but especially you. He took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. When you fail to do your job without bias, you're not just failing people like me, he said, the intensity in his voice building. You're failing the very community you're supposed to protect. Taylor stood frozen, his hands hanging limply at his sides, the shame and guilt in his expression now undeniable. His lips parted but no words came. Daniels, standing beside him, nodded slowly, his expression resolute. Agent Hayes, Daniels said, stepping forward once more. If there's anything I can do to make this right. Anthony shook his head, offering a tired but faint smile. Do your job, he said simply. Do it better than it was done today. That's all I ask. Anthony turned back toward the diner, his gaze unwavering as he walked. The crowd parted, some murmuring soft apologies, others simply lowering their eyes, too ashamed to meet his. Sharon stood at the door, her hands trembling as she spoke. Your breakfast is on the house, Mr. Hayes. I'm so sorry. Her voice cracked, and the weight of her words hung in the air. Anthony nodded, his expression softening just a touch. Thank you, Sharon, he said quietly, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I think I've lost my appetite. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The once whispering patrons sat in eerie silence, their eyes locked on him, the air heavy with discomfort. Anthony lingered near the counter, scanning the room, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He inhaled deeply, gathering himself. This wasn't the first time he'd found himself in a situation like this, though never exactly like this. He cleared his throat and in a calm, unwavering voice addressed the room. I've been in this position before, he began. Not here, not like this, but I've been here. Wrongly judged, wrongly accused, and I'm standing here today, because I know I'm not the only one. This happens every single day to people who look like me, to people who don't have the badge, or the resources to protect them. His words fell like stones in a still pond, each one rippling through the room. The patrons, once suspicious, now sat motionless, their faces lowering in a mixture of shame and understanding. I parked my car, he continued, gesturing out the window. I ordered breakfast just like anyone else. I didn't do anything unusual, but somehow, that was enough to make me a suspect. Enough for someone to call the police. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. I want you all to think about that. Think about how easily someone's life can be turned upside down because of an assumption. Behind the counter, Sharon's hand trembled as she pressed it over her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. She hadn't been the one to call the police, but she felt a heavy guilt for staying silent when she'd overheard the whispers. Anthony turned toward the window where a small group lingered outside, phones in hand. To those recording this, he called out, his voice steady but firm. I hope you're doing more than just capturing a moment. I hope you're thinking about the story you're telling, the lesson it should teach. This isn't just about one bad officer, or one bad call. It's about what happens when we let bias and fear dictate our actions. As he turned back toward the room, his gaze locked with Officer Taylor, who had just stepped inside. The officer stood there, hat in hand, his face pale, his eyes filled with regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but Anthony raised a hand to stop him. I don't need an apology, Anthony said, his tone sharp but controlled. What I need is accountability. What I need is for this to stop happening. Not just to me, but to anyone. Because next time, it might not end like this. Next time, someone could get hurt. Taylor's head hung low. His shoulders slumped under the weight of Anthony's words. The younger officer, Daniels, stepped forward, his voice unwavering. Agent Hayes, he said, his tone firm. I'll personally make sure this is reported and addressed. It won't be swept under the rug. Anthony gave a small nod of acknowledgement. We all have a role to play in making this better, he said, his eyes sweeping the room. It starts with questioning our assumptions, speaking up when we see something wrong, and holding each other accountable. The room was eerily silent, the air thick with the gravity of his words. Slowly, Anthony began to gather his things, his movements deliberate. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to the room. I hope the next time I stop in here, he said quietly, it'll just be for breakfast. With that, he stepped outside, leaving the diner behind. The patrons remained seated, their faces etched with the weight of the day's events. The air, once tense with fear and uncertainty, now lingered with a deep, uncomfortable reckoning. By the end of the day, videos of the encounter had flooded social media, sparking widespread discussions about bias, accountability, and systemic prejudice. The footage showing Anthony Hayes, handcuffed but calm, revealing his identity as an FBI agent, spread like wildfire. Within days, it garnered millions of views, sparking conversations across the country. In Greensboro, the community was divided. Some voiced their outrage, demanding swift action against Officer Taylor. Others, including regulars from the diner, admitted that they had allowed their assumptions to cloud their judgment. For Officer Taylor, the fallout was swift. An internal investigation was launched, and he was placed on administrative leave. Local officials condemned his actions, stressing the importance of acting without bias and properly assessing situations before escalating them. For Anthony, the incident became a platform for change. In the weeks that followed, he was invited to speak at community meetings and forums, sharing his experience and advocating for better training in implicit bias and de-escalation tactics. His calm, measured response to the ordeal resonated with many, turning what could have been a painful memory into a moment of education for the entire city. The diner too saw change. Sharon and her co-workers attended sensitivity training, and the owner posted a sign near the door that read, "Everyone is welcome here." The group of men who had called the police returned a few days later, this time offering an apology. Anthony, after much thought, accepted it with grace but didn't let them off easy. Apologies are a good start, he said, his voice steady. But the real change comes when you stop and question your assumptions before you act. Over time, the diner's atmosphere grew quieter, but its reputation as the place where an FBI agent had confronted bias lingered. It became a symbol of the ongoing work needed to create a community where everyone could feel safe, seen, and respected. As for Anthony, he returned to his work with the FBI, but the incident stayed with him. He carried it not as a burden, but as a reminder of why his job mattered. Not just for solving cases, but for setting an example of what justice should look like. His story sparked national conversations, his words quoted widely. We all have a role to play in making this better. It starts with questioning our assumptions and holding each other accountable. In the end, the incident didn't just change Officer Taylor or the diner patrons or the community. It became a story of hope and transformation, proving that even in the face of injustice, progress is possible when people choose to reflect, learn, and grow.